On October 19, 1781, a British army marched out of Yorktown to surrender. Charles O'Hara carried the sword of Lord Cornwallis toward the Allied commanders, and George Washington directed him to Major General Benjamin Lincoln. The choice carried months earlier. Lincoln had surrendered Charleston under humiliating terms. Now the same officer received the formal submission of a British army. The symmetry is irresistible, but it also raises a harder question. How did Britain's greatest victory of the war in the South become part of the road to its decisive defeat? The answer is not that Charleston magically doomed the empire. It is that the conquest created political, military, and logistical problems that British decisions repeatedly made worse. By the end of 1779, British leaders needed a new way to break the rebellion. Campaigns in the northern states had produced important victories, yet Washington's main army survived. Britain still held New York, but it had not restored royal government across the countryside. France had entered the conflict as an American ally, turning a colonial revolt into a wider imperial war. British troops and ships were now needed in the Caribbean, Europe, and other threatened possessions. The ministry therefore looked south, where officials believed loyalist support could multiply the effect of a smaller regular army. The theory behind the Southern strategy was attractive. British forces would capture the principal ports, restore royal authority, and encourage loyalists to organize. Those local supporters could guard roads, police districts, and hold posts while regular troops advanced from Georgia through the Carolinas and toward Virginia. The plan did not invent Southern loyalism. Many colonists remained attached to the crown for political, economic, religious, or personal reasons. But the South was not a single loyalist reservoir waiting to be opened. It was deeply divided, and local allegiance could be cautious, conditional, or shaped by whoever seemed able to provide protection. That difference between available sympathy and dependable military power would become critical. At first, events supported British confidence. Savannah fell near the end of 1778, and a joint French and American attempt to retake it failed the following year. Charleston was the next and far more valuable objective. It was a rich commercial center, the chief port of South Carolina, and the base from which the remaining Continental forces in the region operated. Sir Henry Clinton also carried the memory of failure there. In 1776, a British expedition had been repulsed at Sullivan's Island. His second attempt would be deliberate, heavily supported, and designed to close every exit before demanding surrender. Clinton left New York in late December with roughly 8,700 soldiers and about 5,000 sailors aboard a fleet of transports and warships. Storms damaged the expedition during its passage, but the force recovered and landed south of Charleston early in 1780. Instead of rushing the defenses, Clinton moved overland across the coastal islands and waterways. Engineers, infantry, cavalry, artillery, and the Royal Navy worked as parts of one operation. By late March, British troops had crossed the Ashley River and begun establishing siege lines across the narrow peninsula above the city. Major General Benjamin Lincoln faced an unforgiving choice. He commanded Continental troops, state forces, and militia inside a city whose civilian leaders feared what abandonment would mean. Leaving early might have preserved much of the Southern Army, but it would have surrendered the region's political and commercial center without a prolonged defense. Remaining offered time for reinforcements that never arrived in sufficient strength. As the British investment tightened, the decision became irreversible. The Navy moved into the harbor past Fort Moultrie. British cavalry and infantry struck American positions beyond the city. At Monk's Corner in April, Banastra Tarleton's British Legion helped break the remaining American control of the routes north and east of Charleston. The siege then became a contest measured in yards. British engineers dug successive parallels closer to the American works. Batteries increased the pressure while food, ammunition, and confidence inside the city diminished. The Cooper River route, once the best hope for escape, was no longer secure. Civilians and soldiers endured bombardment together, and negotiations failed to produce acceptable terms. On May 12, after about 6 weeks of formal siege operations, Lincoln surrendered the city and his command. The scale of the capture made Charleston the greatest British battlefield success of the Southern Campaign and one of the worst American defeats of the Revolution. More than 3,000 Continental soldiers were among the prisoners, and the total taken, including militia and other defenders, exceeded 5,000. British forces also acquired more than 300 cannon, about 6,000 muskets, and extensive military stores. Organized Continental resistance in the lower South had been shattered for the moment. Clinton had captured the port, the army defending it, and the materiel required to rebuild that army. The surrender ceremony reinforced the meaning of the defeat. Clinton denied Lincoln's force the honors of war. The Americans could not march out with colors displayed and the ceremonial dignity commonly requested by a professional army. Their flags were cased and their music restricted. For Britain, the scene announced restored authority. For the Patriot cause, it showed how completely the Southern position had collapsed. Yet a surrender could remove an army without settling the loyalties of everyone beyond the city walls. Britain now had to turn military possession into durable government across a vast and divided countryside. That distinction was easy to miss in the immediate celebration. A port could be occupied, its warehouses inventoried, and its approaches defended. Political obedience was harder to measure. South Carolina's settlements were connected by long roads, ferries, rivers, and personal networks that no victory parade could command. Royal authority would be judged not only by proclamations issued in Charleston, but by whether a farmer in the backcountry believed British protection would still exist after the nearest regiment marched away. To make the conquest permanent, Britain needed people to provide intelligence, transport supplies, identify opponents, and serve in local units. The Southern strategy therefore depended on trust at precisely the moment when the occupation began demanding proof of loyalty. That was the moment when policy began to erode the value of victory. In the first weeks after Charleston, British proclamations offered pardons or parole arrangements that allowed many people to return home. For exhausted inhabitants, this provided a way to stop fighting without immediately becoming active soldiers for the Crown. Such neutrality did not prove affection for Britain, but it could reduce resistance. Clinton then changed the bargain. His proclamation of June 3rd released many men from parole while requiring them to declare allegiance and perform the duties of British subjects, including military service when ordered. The measure was intended to convert submission into usable loyalist strength. Instead, it narrowed the space in which weary or undecided South Carolinians could remain passive. A man who had accepted defeat and gone back to his farm might now be expected to serve against Patriot neighbors or relatives. Refusal could expose him to punishment and loss. The choice was no longer simply rebellion or quiet withdrawal. British authority demanded action. The proclamation did not transform every neutral into a patriot, and violence came from both sides, but it gave resistance leaders a powerful recruiting argument. The occupation would not permit people to sit safely outside the Civil War. Before that political damage could be measured, an event in the Waxhaws gave it an emotional symbol. On May 29th, Tarleton overtook a retreating Virginia force commanded by Abraham Buford near the North Carolina border. Tarleton had driven his men and horses hard to close the distance, then demanded surrender. Buford declined the initial terms, and the British attack rapidly broke his formation. More than 100 Americans were killed and about 150 wounded from a force of only a few hundred. What happened during the collapse became fiercely disputed. Patriot accounts claimed men were cut down while attempting to surrender. British explanations emphasized confusion after Tarleton's horse was shot, and soldiers believed their commander had been killed. The surviving evidence does not make every action or intention certain. The political effect is much clearer. Americans labeled the engagement a massacre, and the phrase "Tarleton's Quarter" came to mean that surrender offered no mercy. The story spread faster than any official qualification. British victory had produced not intimidation alone, but a rallying cry. This mattered because the struggle in South Carolina was becoming a civil war fought through households, kinship networks, and local grudges. Loyalist and Patriot militias raided, confiscated, burned, and retaliated. People often chose sides under pressure rather than from simple ideology. British posts could dominate towns and roads, but control of a district depended on information, supplies, and cooperation that regular troops could not compel everywhere at once. Every harsh search, broken protection, or forced oath risked creating another armed opponent. Every Patriot reprisal could drive someone toward the crown. Occupation therefore magnified the very divisions on which the Southern strategy depended. Patriot commanders learned to use that environment. Francis Marion emerged in the Low Country, where swamps, rivers, forests, and dispersed settlements made pursuit difficult. His small commands attacked communications, surprised detachments, recovered prisoners, and disappeared before larger British forces could concentrate. Marion did not win a conventional campaign by himself, but he made British movement expensive and uncertain. His growing reputation as the Swamp Fox captured the problem. The army that had taken Charleston could not force a mobile local enemy to stand still. Thomas Sumter returned to the war after British forces destroyed his plantation. He rallied militia in the Backcountry and fought a series of hard, uneven actions. Andrew Pickens had accepted British protection and parole after Charleston, then resumed Patriot service as the occupation failed to provide the security that submission had appeared to promise. These leaders differed in temperament and method, and their forces did not always cooperate smoothly. Together with many lesser-known militia officers and civilians, however, they kept armed resistance alive when no strong Southern Continental army remained. The resulting warfare attacked the British system rather than merely its soldiers. Couriers disappeared. Supply wagons required escorts. Small garrisons became isolated. Forage parties risked ambush. A post established to secure a district consumed troops that Cornwallis could not use in the next advance. A column sent to chase partisans could exhaust itself without forcing a decisive engagement. The British still possessed professional discipline, cavalry mobility, and the ability to win large battles. What they lacked was enough manpower to guard every route, protect every loyalist community, and pursue every mobile band across the Carolinas. This imbalance changed the value of time. A British column had to find its target, force an engagement, and return without leaving another district exposed. A partisan band could scatter, wait, and assemble again when the regulars moved on. Local knowledge helped militia choose crossings, guides, hiding places, and sympathetic households. It also made the war intimate and dangerous for civilians, because information itself became a weapon. The Crown could punish a community suspected of aiding rebels, but punishment might create fresh enemies. It could arm loyalists, but each local unit needed support and faced retaliation if abandoned. The military map showed British posts. The human map around those posts remained unstable. For a time, spectacular battlefield success concealed that weakness. On August 16, 1780, Cornwallis met a newly organized American army under Horatio Gates near Camden. The American militia on the left broke early under pressure from British regulars. Continental troops on the other wing, including men led by Baron de Kalb, resisted fiercely but were overwhelmed. De Kalb was mortally wounded, Gates's army disintegrated, and the Patriot command in the south suffered another disaster. 2 days later, Tarleton surprised Sumter at Fishing Creek. After Charleston, the Waxhaws, Camden, and Fishing Creek, British claims of southern mastery did not look unreasonable. But those victories did not solve the occupation problem. Gates had lost an army, yet Patriot militia continued to assemble. The British could defeat a formation in the field and still find their supply line attacked the following week. Loyalist recruitment became dangerous because a royal victory in one county did not guarantee protection after the regulars moved away. Cornwallis needed to carry the campaign into North Carolina, but his western flank depended on Major Patrick Ferguson and a largely loyalist force operating in the Backcountry. Ferguson tried to suppress support coming from settlements beyond the mountains, his warning that he would cross the range and punish those communities if resistance continued had the opposite effect. Militia from what are now Tennessee and neighboring regions gathered at Sycamore Shoals, crossed the mountains, and joined other Patriot forces. Leaders including William Campbell, Isaac Shelby, and John Sevier selected mounted men for a rapid pursuit. On October 7th, they found Ferguson and roughly 1,000 Loyalists on Kings Mountain. The Patriots surrounded the wooded ridge and climbed from several directions. Ferguson's men repeatedly used bayonet charges to drive attackers downhill, but the militia withdrew among the trees and returned as soon as the charge lost momentum. In a little more than an hour, Ferguson was dead and his command destroyed as an effective force. Patriot losses were 28 killed and 62 wounded. More than 100 defenders were killed, many more wounded, and roughly 700 captured. Ferguson was the only British regular soldier on the field. Most of the combatants on both sides were Americans. The battle exposed the Southern strategy's deepest danger. Mobilizing Loyalists could intensify resistance without ensuring that Britain could protect those who answered its call. Kings Mountain forced Cornwallis to postpone his advance into North Carolina and withdraw deeper into South Carolina. It revived Patriot morale after months of defeat and damaged Loyalist confidence. It did not decide the campaign, but it changed the political weather. A British victory no longer appeared inevitable. George Washington soon placed Major General Nathanael Greene in command of the Southern Department. Greene arrived in December to find a weak army, scarce supplies, exhausted communities, and an opponent that was still tactically formidable. Greene understood that preserving American resistance mattered more than holding any particular field. He divided his smaller force, sending Daniel Morgan west while he operated elsewhere. The division helped the Americans find food and forage, encouraged Patriot militia, and threatened British posts in the interior. It also presented Cornwallis with separated targets. The risk was severe. If the British destroyed either wing before they reunited, Greene could lose the campaign. Cornwallis sent Tarleton to eliminate Morgan. Morgan stopped at Cowpens and arranged his defense around the different strengths of his men. Skilled riflemen formed an advanced screen. Militia stood behind them with instructions to deliver controlled fire before withdrawing. Continental regulars occupied the stronger line farther back, while cavalry waited in reserve. The design gave inexperienced troops a limited task instead of demanding that they withstand an indefinite bayonet attack. It also invited an aggressive opponent to believe that another American collapse had begun. On January 17, 1781, Tarleton attacked before his tired force had fully recovered from the pursuit. The American forward lines fired and fell back as planned. British troops pressed ahead, assuming the retreat meant victory. During the confusion, part of the Continental line began to withdraw, but Morgan restored order and turned the movement into a sudden about-face and volley. American cavalry struck, militia returned on the flanks, and the British force was enveloped. The battle ended in a complete Patriot victory. British losses included more than 100 killed, more than 200 wounded, and about 500 captured. Tarleton escaped, but the mobile force Cornwallis relied upon to dominate the backcountry had been crippled. Cowpens transformed the campaign because Cornwallis could not easily replace those veterans. He pursued Morgan and Greene, destroyed much of his own baggage to move faster, and drove his army across North Carolina in the race to the Dan. The Americans carried prisoners and preserved their forces while seeking the safety of Virginia. Rain-swollen rivers and exhausted men turned the pursuit into a contest of timing. Greene crossed the Dan River before Cornwallis could trap him. The British had marched far from their supply system and gained no decisive result. Once reinforced, Greene returned to North Carolina and chose ground near Guilford Courthouse. On March 15th, Cornwallis attacked an American force arranged in successive lines. Greene eventually withdrew, leaving the British in possession of the battlefield. By conventional measure, Cornwallis had won. The cost made that victory nearly unusable. From roughly 1,900 Crown troops engaged, 93 were killed and more than 400 wounded. The loss amounted to about 28% of the force, including experienced officers and soldiers Britain could not readily replace. Greene still had an army. Cornwallis could neither destroy it nor continue deep inland without recovery and supplies. He moved to Wilmington on the North Carolina coast, where the Royal Navy could support him. From there, he chose to enter Virginia, believing that disrupting the resources sustaining resistance in the Carolinas could achieve what pursuit had not. The decision also exposed the growing strategic divide between Cornwallis and Clinton. Distance slowed their correspondence, instructions left room for disagreement, and each commander judged the other's priorities through an increasingly strained relationship. Clinton worried about New York and the security of British bases. Cornwallis wanted freedom to strike where he believed the rebellion remained vulnerable. While Cornwallis moved north, Greene returned south. His campaign did not consist of an effortless series of victories. He was checked at Hobkirk's Hill and failed to capture the fortified post at 96 during a prolonged siege. Yet Patriot pressure, partisan cooperation, and the shortage of British manpower made the interior posts harder to sustain. Fort Watson and Fort Mott fell. Camden and 96 were evacuated. By late 1781, British power in the lower south was increasingly compressed toward the coast. Charleston and Savannah remained in British hands, but the broad restoration of royal government imagined by the Southern strategy had failed. Greene's achievement was cumulative rather than theatrical. He did not need every attack to succeed if each operation forced Britain to spend men, time, and supplies defending an interior it could no longer use as a secure base. When one garrison withdrew, Patriot civil and military influence could reappear behind it. When another remained, it required a road, escorts, provisions, and relief plans. The same arithmetic that had favored Britain at Charleston now worked against it. Concentration had made the siege powerful. Dispersion made the occupation brittle. By keeping an American field force alive and coordinating, however imperfectly, with local resistance, Greene denied the British the quiet required to convert tactical victories into a settled province. Cornwallis, meanwhile, established a base at Yorktown on the Virginia Peninsula. A port offered connection to British naval power, but it also placed his army side waters an enemy fleet could close. In September, the French fleet under the Comte de Grasse fought a British fleet near the mouth of the Chesapeake. The Battle of the Capes lasted only a few hours, yet its consequence was decisive. The damaged British fleet returned to New York, and French control of the bay denied Cornwallis reinforcement or evacuations by sea. Washington and the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, had been threatening New York. Once the opportunity in Virginia became clear, they shifted their combined army south in a rapid movement that concealed its objective for as long as possible. By late September, American and French troops had joined forces around Yorktown while French ships sealed the water. The strategic situation now reversed Charleston. At Charleston, British land and naval forces had progressively closed every American exit. At Yorktown, Cornwallis found his own army enclosed by Allied siege lines and hostile naval control. Allied engineers dug parallels and moved artillery nearer to the British defenses. American and French troops captured key redoubts, allowing the siege works to advance. Cornwallis attempted to move men across the York River, but the effort failed. On October 17th, a British drummer signaled a request to negotiate. 2 days later, the garrison marched out to lay down its weapons. Cornwallis, pleading illness, sent O'Hara to represent him. O'Hara approached Rochambeau, who indicated Washington. Washington then directed the subordinate officer to his own second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln. Washington did not grant the British the full honors of war that had been denied at Charleston. Lincoln accepted the ceremonial sword and returned it. The scene offered a powerful conclusion, but the military lesson is larger than revenge or poetic justice. Charleston had not predetermined Yorktown. French alliance, naval power, American endurance, local civil conflict, British command disputes, and many decisions made across more than a year all shaped the outcome. Yet Charleston created the test Britain failed. Could an army turn a captured city and a shattered enemy formation into stable political control? The British answer relied too heavily on expected loyalist manpower and too little on the conditions required to protect it. Clinton's June proclamation pushed passive inhabitants toward an active choice. The Waxhaws supplied Patriot propaganda with a memorable image of brutality. Dispersed garrisons consumed regular troops. Partisan warfare attacked the connective tissue of occupation. Kings Mountain destroyed a loyalist force and checked the advance. Cowpens removed much of Tarleton's command. Guilford Courthouse cost Cornwallis veterans he could not spare. His move into Virginia then placed a depleted army where French control of the Chesapeake could trap it. Britain therefore did not lose because it stopped winning battles. It lost the Southern campaign while winning several of its most dramatic ones. The mistake was to confuse the defeat of an army with the submission of a population, and the possession of strategic points with control of the country between them. Charleston showed how effective British power could be when land forces, engineers, cavalry, and the Navy worked toward one objective. The months that followed showed how quickly that power weakened when policy alienated potential neutrals, occupation dispersed scarce troops, and commanders pursued incompatible solutions. That is why Benjamin Lincoln's presence at Yorktown matters. He embodied both ends of the campaign without proving that history moved in a perfect circle. At Charleston, he represented an American army trapped by superior coordination. At Yorktown, he stood within an Allied system that had achieved the same kind of enclosure against Britain. The transformation between those moments was built through endurance, local resistance, tactical adaptation, French intervention, and British miscalculation. Charleston was Britain's greatest Southern victory. Its tragedy for the empire was not that victory itself, but the belief that conquest had already done the harder work of governing.